Okay, everybody, this is Chapter 8. We're going to talk about power and policymaking. We're going to talk a little bit about bureaucracy. In addition to that, we're also going to talk about um, justice systems throughout the world. And we'll kind of, like I said, compare it to our own country so we can maybe make a little bit of a different, maybe comparing and contrasting of what we have here as a judicial system here in the U.S. Now, when we talk about policymaking happens in all parts of government, in all governments that exist. Um, Usually, policies are goals that are established by the government to address a certain area, whether it's healthcare, immigration, military, defense spending, a bunch of different issues that the government is responsible for making decisions on. Okay, so when we look at the case of um, formulating policy usually begins at, the very beginning in our formulation stage where we identify a problem and propose actions to kind of solve that problem. And at the end, we put it into place. Now, I always like to put an addition into this stage at the final end of it where, we kind of have to reevaluate our policy to make sure to see where it's worked or if there's any unintended consequences. But for the most part, remember the implementation stage will happen at the end. Um, Executive branches are going to dominate policymaking. The cabinet here in the U.S. formulates and generates policies for the United States, along with our legislative branch, which debates and adopts policies. And along with that, the executive branch will implement it, and outside of this is the judicial branch, which kind of acts as a check and makes sure that uh, there's no violation of laws within that system. Um, Now, when we look at parliamentary forms of government, they have little policymaking powers. Usually, the many powerful legislatures are in presidential systems like the one we have in the U.S. Um, Now, when we talk about the U.S. Congress, power of the Congress may seem counterintuitive. Legislators have their own electoral base that they have to keep happy, and presidents cannot take support from own parties' legislators for granted. I don't think we see this often here in the U.S. nowadays. It seems like a lot of the GOP is kind of submitting to Trump a bit, even though a lot of them came out originally against him. But for re-election purposes, that might not be the wisest position to take now in some of the red states. Um, One of the, when we talk about the impact of legislative rules and resources, as we see in Congress, there's going to be rules that the Congress has to operate on in order to implement a policy. They can control the agenda, meaning that they can decide which issues come out, which policies are important enough to be addressed. And these committees are, as we see them here in the U.S. Congress, committees both in the Senate and in the House act as kind of gatekeepers where they let things in, but they also keep things out. Now, if we look at staff support in legislatures, go ahead and look at each of these countries. And as we can see in the United States, usually we have about 14 members of a staff with House of Representative members and 34 members of a staff with members of the Senate. So each money is allocated to a congressperson and they can spend it on staff salaries. As we see in other countries, it's a little bit different. Now, one thing that we can definitely, kind of relate here in the United States is citizens tend to have a low opinion of legislatures. That's just how it is. You know what I mean? So, in conjunction with the executive branch, as composed of the executive branch, we do have something called the bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is basically, by definition, a person that sits behind a desk, and that person is not elected. Um, so, non-political body of professional experts. Career bureaucrats in the United States much less influential than in other liberal democracies. Now, we always kind of, when we hear the word bureaucracies and we think of a a bureaucratic organization here in the United States. I think the one that we can all agree on and the one we hate going to is probably the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? Because we see it as maybe inefficient, in some instances incompetent. Um, if we go back to many, many years ago, you could see some of these bureaucracies as corrupt. I'm not, quite sure now. There's a lot of ethics laws and a lot of eyes on bureaucracies now that, maybe at the lower levels it's harder to be corrupt. Before I did this job, I worked for the county, and in all actuality, there's a lot of ethics classes that are given. If you helped somebody positively, if they wanted to reward you with a gift or anything like that, you couldn't take it. So that might be an illustration of that. So when we kind of look at how bureaucracy is developed today, so if you want to get a job with the government, you need to have the knowledge-based recruitment, meaning that you have to recruit based off of merit. You can't simply give jobs away as a result of patronage. These are very, very systematic procedures where you have to follow policies, and it's hierarchical organizations. The DMV is one, Social Security is one. All these bureaucratic organizations will have a hierarchy where you have a person that works at the bottom, maybe a supervisor, a director, a deputy director, then the head of the organization. So just kind of some examples of that. And militaries are kind of the best examples of bureaucracy where you do have that set of systematic procedures and you do have a clear chain of command. Okay, let's go ahead and, when we kind of focus on how bureaucrats make decisions, we expect them to be sources of expert knowledge. And since few politicians are experts in technical fields, they have to rely on bureaucrats to maybe be able to address certain public policy issues. Okay, so if we talk about governments that work outside the military, as we all know, it's probably common knowledge that it's hard to get a job within the government just because of the high demand for jobs, because they're really good jobs. And when we talk about good jobs, what do we mean? Jobs with a livable wage, jobs with benefits, jobs with a pension. But in the United States, we kind of have to get hired based off of merit on these type of organizations other than the military. France and Japan have specific schools for civil servants, and bureaucrats are considered the best and the brightest. We talked a little bit about patronage, kind of that giving of jobs where, in return for support. So if I run for office and you support me, and as a reward for you supporting me, I give you a government job, that's an example of patronage. We have something called the Pendleton Act here in the United States that went away from the patronage system to a more merit-based system. And like I mentioned in other lectures, if you take the 102 class, you're going to focus a little bit more on the Pendleton Act, where it addresses what are some of the steps and what was some of the reasonings that went into a more merit-based hiring system. Okay, let's go ahead and look at unelected legal experts or the power of judges here, and we'll use the United States as a kind of a guiding point when we talk about this. Making a rule to part of the legal order generally means that people obey it. As we learned with the social contract, we give up certain rights. In returns, we have to obey the law, right? And as a result of obeying the law, the government is supposed to protect us. And as part of this, judges are called on to interpret the law. Now, if we look at the American model or the American system of justice, judges are supposed to be, and I'm going to stress the supposed to be term, they're supposed to be interpreters of the law that are neutral. Liberal democracy had the rule of law before democracy. So if we talk about the rule of law and we look at that in the United States, what do we mean by that? What is the rule of law? The rule of law is basically that we have certain procedures that we follow in order for it to be a legal society, right? Specifically here in the United States, it's the concept of due process, right? Due process establishes our rule of law. So if we're in trouble, we go through a system of procedures that make sure we get a fair trial. If we have a civil uh, disagreement with somebody, then we have the right to take it to court. This establishes the rule of law. And it's the law is a powerful statement, right? Why don't you want to drive in the carpool lane by yourself? Because it's the law, and you're facing a you know kind of a financial penalty if you do that. In a sense, when we talk about the law specifically, we need judges to interpret laws because sometimes laws can be ambiguous or unclear. Um, and the author talks about the appropriate limits of free speech, right? I think in um, one state, I think so they're trying to ban the Pledge of Allegiance in a in the schools in one of the states. I'm not quite sure. I just briefly read through that, and when we talk about the that is you know, are we going to require people to say the Pledge of Allegiance, or just because the Pledge of Allegiance has the end part is under God, is that something that might be a violation of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution? Just kind of a throwing it out there where this is eventually going to be argued by people in front of a judge or a group of justices. Most judges in the world are not elected. Here in the United States, judges on the federal level are not elected. They're appointed by the president and serve for life. In California, however, most judges that we would probably deal with, whether it's a traffic, divorce, probate, civil, criminal type judge, if they're a state judge, they're going to be nominated by the governor, and they will have to run for re-election every few years. Okay, now when we talk about common law versus civil code law, common law is based off of, where the judiciary is going to be a separate branch of government. We are innocent until proven guilty. And a lot of our rulings are going to be based on precedent. So if you want to make the argument that abortion should be illegal, and if we take it up to the Supreme Court, um, in all actuality, the Supreme Court has to rule on precedent and make the decision that since that's already been addressed in Roe versus Wade, then we shouldn't try to change subtle law. It's not something that's required by the Constitution or required by any court rules or laws, but most of the times judges will operate off of precedent and say, okay, this law has already been decided. We're not going to go back and re-argue it. That doesn't mean that won't happen, but just kind of to know that out there, right? Talk a little bit about, we have constitutional law and statute law. We have both of these here in the United States. Statutes are, your penal codes, your civil codes, your health and safety codes that are all at the state level as well as at the federal level. We have the United States codes, and we have constitutional laws where laws that are based off of our constitutional rights. Here's a map of code law, common law, mixed, and shari law throughout the world. So when we say judges in a common law system, we have administrative laws, common law, which we talked about. Judges act as arbitrators in an adversarial system. And judges are supposed to be deeply independent from the government, which, we really might not see at times. We talked about that. And here's a little bit more of a illustration of that. Code law, are laws that are legal systems to create more systematic regulations and leave less interpretations to judges. Things are going to be black or white. The influence of the Napoleonic codes. Most systematic comprehensive laws that leave less interpretation. A comprehensive lawmaking, and judges will apply the code more than precedent. And judges can also, in a sense, ask questions in a trial as we have here in our common law system, judges aren't able to ask questions, they just rule on matters of procedure. Now, in the United States, we have something called the concept of judicial review. And what judicial review is that the Supreme Court has the ability to review whether or not a law is constitutional or not. The greatest power, the most absolute power that any branch of government has. And that's my opinion. Not, take it for what it's worth. That's just how I feel. So, when we talk about the United States, we have a process of concrete reviews. They can review all court decisions, whether it's from a federal court or a state court, and also Supreme Court judges can determine what cases they want to hear. They don't have to hear every case that is appointed to them, that is appealed to them. Code law talks a little bit about code law here, and constitutional courts in the European model. I also put an illustration of Germany, so you could see how Germany does their system of law. And talks a little bit more about bureaucracies and some power that, since these people generally are appointed, some of the checks and balances or some of the recourse that we have against these people might not exist. Okay, so that's what I have for Chapter 8. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.